Hi, everyone. Thank you to Professors Solo, Jorens, Obina, Komoyane, Becker, and Eck, as well as Ms. Makoko, Mr. Goldberg, and Mr. Wilkinson for your valuable contribution to our conference. For our next session, we will be hearing from a few speakers. Professor Jorens of Belgium is a professor of European social law and social criminal law. Professor Strban of Slovenia is a professor in the Department of Labor Law and Social Security Law. Ms. Rotendo Mudarikwa of Zimbabwe is an associate at Nyangi Law Chambers in Harare. Mr. Clement Kasonde of Zambia is the executive director of the Labour Institute of Zambia. And in addition, Dr. Kanyongolo and Professor Matsikidze assisted with their preparations. All these bios are available on the conference platform. So how the next session is going to work is we will play a recorded video that is approximately 45 minutes long. And thereafter, the speakers will join us for Q&A. Please don't forget to leave us your questions on the discussion page. We will now be moving over to the pre-recorded video. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Many thanks also for attending this session about the inventions of social protection with a spotlight on COVID-19. My name is Jorens from Ghent University. The other members who will speak immediately are the first-hand Gregor Strban from the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. We have afterwards Mrs. Mudarikwa Rotendo from Zimbabwe. That issue then, we will have Mr. Clement Kasonde from Mudarikwa University in Zambia. So, but without losing any time, I would immediately like to give now the floor to Gregor for his first introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Yves. Hello, dear ladies and gentlemen. This presentation will be dealing with legal nature of social protection interventions due to COVID-19. So, next slide, please. So the first question is, what is social protection and how it could be defined? Well, social security in international law is a very well-known notion. We have the right to social security, and even some documents mention the right to social insurance as a possible path to achieve the right to social security. I'm having in mind especially the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Well, in international law, social assistance is being distinct from social security because it used to be discretionary, but that has, of course, changed during the time. Now, we also have the right to social protection in international law. It's in the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. It's a relatively new notion, but it has advantages. It does not cover strictly what is social security or social assistance. It can go broader, cover also people in informal work, which could be outside of social insurance. But it also has some drawbacks. It is a new notion. It's not very well defined. But let us turn to the next slide, please, and try to see what is the distinction between social security, which is part of social protection, social compensation, and social advantages. Now, we will leave aside a bit social advantages, which could be numerous and various, but focus on social security and social compensation. Social security is very much risk-oriented. When people lose their money or lose their income or they're facing some additional costs, there are social risks that occur, like unemployment, old age, disability, and so on. And they have to be compensated, or they have to have some benefits to overcome that situations, which occur quite regularly in the lives of individuals. Well, that is needed to provide existence and free development of individuals and societies as such. Social compensation is a bit different. It stems from the state sovereignty and state power or monopoly of power, and states should compensate people at some extraordinary occurrences. Next slide, please. These occurrences could be, next slide, please. Thank you. These occurrences could be like negative effects of mandatory vaccination, which state can prescribe, victims of war or to victims of criminal offenses, but nowadays also to victims of pandemic. It could hardly be argued that the state is responsible for the virus or disease itself, but it is responsible for certain measures taken to contain it. like lockdowns or limitation of certain activities. So in that case, the state should, because it's causing hardship, should provide some compensation. Next slide, please. So if we have a distinction between social insurance and social compensation, why do we need that distinction? Why is it important? Because in order to have structured social policy and structured social legislation, we need to bring some order, in a sense, in the otherwise what would be social protection jungle. Next slide, please. Well, there are some examples, like, for instance, pension supplements. Many countries have provided some additional income to pensioners. Although pensioners did not lose any money, pensions have not been reduced. But what has been increased is healthcare needs of pensioners. And some argue it might be also a hidden tool to privatize healthcare, because you give money to pensioners and they have to buy private healthcare. Another example could be universal income for the self-employed. So many self-employed people have been left without an income. Some argue it could be also universal basic income. Is it really so? I have my doubts. But also, it's very interesting to observe universal basic income, because quite left-wing parties and right-wing parties come together in that notion for all different reasons, of course. The main problem with universal basic income could be that it can be unjust. If you treat people in the same legal position distinctively, it's not right. But if you treat all people in different positions equally, it's also not right. So I have my doubts about universal basic income, but universal income or some sort of income for self-employed was a social compensation measure. Well, social compensation measures could reach out also to informal workers, which is quite difficult for social insurance, which is quite labor-oriented. Next slide, please. And that brings me to some conclusions. The only constant thing in society is change, and social protection should be modernized and change constantly. The core question is in which direction and how the crisis can influence that. The crises are always opportunities, but the question is for who and for which measures. There should be a proper share of responsibilities in societies between social security and security and social insurances, between the state with social compensation measures, but also individuals and their responsibility. So in order to bring some structure and to provide social protection for all, this was the intention of this presentation. And social protection, of course, should always be based on the principle of solidarity, which is the fiber between members of society in each society. Thank you for your kind attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grega, for having sketched, I would say, a kind of global legal framework on how to react to this pandemic of COVID-19. I want to concentrate shortly on the European reaction in the member states. Next slides, please. What we have seen is clearly that within the European Union, being a region which is completely hit by this pandemic, about 8 million people. Yeah, next slide, please. 8 million people are hit by this pandemic, and Europe is clearly one of the hardest hit regions in the world. The economic impact is great. The European Union and member states expect that the economy will contract by 7.8% this year. And not only this year, because that is one of the lessons we can learn from previous crises. Remember the crisis, the financial crisis, 2007, 2010, that the economy will always recover only after a few years. Contrary to the previous crisis in 2007, the first crisis demonstrated especially a kind of problem in the capital market, which led to a huge influence on the private pensions with a switch to the public pension systems. Now we see that the challenges are much broader in a global domain: health, unemployment, labor market, family policy. How did the EU and the member states now react? If you want to ask that question, you always have to take care of one element. It's the subsidiarity, meaning that the European Union can only react in case they are competent. And in the domain of social protection, labor and health, basically the member states remain competent. The biggest thing that the European Union has done is an unprecedented relief fund. Sure, which stands for support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency, which is a huge fund of 1,800 billion euros that will give cheap loans to the member states in order to set up systems of short-time allowance and unemployment benefits, partial unemployment benefits. Next slide, please. Indeed, this element of short-time work allowances is a system that we already noticed in the previous crisis in 2007. Why is this system so important? It has multiple advantages. It avoids dismissals, employees remain on board, so if the economy is recovering, the employer doesn't have to look for new people. On the same moment, the employees get still their salary which is guaranteed by the employer. So the employer doesn't have to pay dismissal money, but on the one hand, the state is subsidizing also part of this salary of the employer, and so it's also an advantage for the employer and for the state because people remain in employment, have their salary and can spend. So spending is good for the economy. This is a system which is widely used. We see that in several countries, even more than 45% of the overall workforce was or is covered by these systems. It implies different changes in labor law. We see that the systems that already existed were broadened to other groups of people and economies. New systems were set up. There was a substantial increase in compensatory indemnity. Minimum wages increased. A lot of countries foresee that the employees will still get 100% of their salary. At the same moment, we see changes in social security law, extension of the duration, alleviation of the conditions. We don't have to have any control measures anymore, increase in benefits. Next slide, please. However, what we notice, of course, this is all fine, but it's good for people who are in stable employment. Self-employed people, by definition, are not covered by these systems. And this is clearly a group which can be found under the measures taken. There is an equalization of rights and an extension of protection, basically of employees to self-employed. The European Pillar of Social Rights guarantees everybody in the European Union, it's a principal matter, a right to an adequate income regardless your professional occupation. How is this done? Well, a lot of member states, you can see it's very popular, have giving hardship funds and subsidies to the self-employed, even sometimes without control measure. Give the money and hope you will recover by that. Other countries have kind of set up a kind of what I call embryonal unemployment benefit system for the self-employed. They also now got a system. Next slide. Third measures, a lot of them also for self-employed are, of course, with the compliance of contributions, defer the payment, cancellation or reduction of payment of contributions. Very important is teleworking. Teleworking is now seen as the new normal. Teleworking, working from home, was not so popular. It gained some popularity just before the crisis, but now member states and employers are forced to do it. And it's getting a very positive reaction, and many employees will now consider that teleworking will be the new normal. It has a positive reaction, but also a lot of challenges. You need technological tools. You need a legal framework. Is it voluntary? Is it reversible or not? There are a lot of new motivational risks. One of the new diseases is burnout, depression, also because people are working at home. And the job quality. People always say there's a lot of pressure from the employer. I stay at home and they can reach me every moment. And the combination of professional and private life, isolation, you don't meet your colleagues. Next slide. Extra measures are also sickness benefits, alleviation of conditions, immediate recovery, the state that covers part of the continued payment of salary by the employers. And I come back to that, facilitation of administrative formalities. You don't even have to send in a form that you're sick, just phone to the doctor and phone to your employer. Some countries recognized, in some countries, even COVID-19 as an occupational disease, which is important for preventive measures. And as schools had to close, children at home, what should the parents do? A lot of states have set up support mechanisms for parents due to the closure of school, sometimes as an extra parental leave or sometimes as a special care allowance, in particular when teleworking is basically not possible due to work you have. Next slide, please. You see that a lot of measures have been focusing on the economic sector. What we also saw is, but slightly limited, I have to say, is the poor. Are they forgotten? No. I mean, we see in some countries some measures, but more limited. funds or vouchers are set up in Spain and France, and vouchers for school meals, but less countries have set up special measures for combating poverty. Very important is the simplification of the administrative process. For granting of the benefits, ask for control, e-tools, automatic processes, virtual assistance has been set up. Suddenly, everything which was done on paper is now done basically on an automatic process. Next slide, please. Important in that respect is, however, I told you, is okay, Europe has limited competence, but they look from behind the corner. Taking into account that a lot of these measures are good for people in a stable employment situation, they also say, well, we have to take care. The right to an adequate minimum income is necessary for non-standard workers. And they've done it a couple of weeks ago, 28th of October, there is a proposal of a European directive on adequate minimum wages, people in a non-standard, and the member states and the council made the conclusions where they're saying that they should all work together in supporting minimum income protection schemes, in combating poverty and social inclusions, which is accessible, adequate, and enables everybody a good market and social inclusions. So my last slide now, please, is what we have seen is that a lot of member states have taken special measures to safeguard the economy and employability. We all have to wait whether this can be guaranteed after Corona is hopefully quick over and the measures will be stopped. At the same moment, we have to question ourselves, what is the result? Because sometimes we have seen that member states have taken measures, even with good intentions, but sometimes with unintended and durable side effects. What will be the result of these ad hoc measures? Will they still survive? Will they become achievements, like a system for unemployment for self-employed people, bigger people, like extension of these short time allowances, like more taking into account the economic problems? Are we going to take this as an achievement as well? Automatization, control measures on that, how are you going to deal with that? So to use a quote of a famous football player and football trainer, every disadvantage comes with an advantage. Perhaps we also have to see this crisis as a way to rethink and rebuild our social system. I thank you for your attention as well, and me too, I'm looking forward to the questions, but I give now immediately the floor further to Ritenda.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm going to look at social protection and COVID in Africa with a specific case study on innovative measures to ensure social protection for the self-employed in three selected African countries, mainly Mauritius, Kenya, and South Africa. In general, the COVID pandemic has had a similar effect on the African economy, and African governments have put in place a raft of measures, including social protection measures, to assist members and the nation at large. So when you look at a country like Mauritius, for example, it provides a basis whereby Mauritius slide, please. Yes, on Mauritius, basically what happened with Mauritius was that the government put in place a wage assistance scheme, whereby what the Mauritian government's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic was that it put in place a measure for the formal employment, and then also put in place measures that covered the self-employed. So for example, they put in place a government assistance scheme, which included those employed to prevent job losses, and then on the other side, they provided a COVID assistance scheme for the formal sector, where there was a guaranteed scheme for the self-employed. And then in terms of loans also, the government put in place a number of, it was more or less social compensation for the lockdown measures that were put in place. So there you will see there were special loans for the informal sector, and there were moratoriums on the capital and interest repayments on those loans. And then at the same time, the government put in place rent relief measures for people, for both accommodation and also business, and then looking for and of significance for the self-employed as a form of some sort of a social compensation scheme. The government put in place a waiver on fees for market stores, which then provided some sort of a social protection measure for the street vendors. And then in terms of its outlook, because of importance when you look at it, when we consider approaches to social protection is, okay, what was there before? And Mauritius had quite a comprehensive social protection framework, which included social insurance and at the same time social assistance that worked together well as an innovative way to ensure a life cycle of social protection for the workers. But then at the same time, now in the face of COVID, they put in place the raft of measures, and what was central and what has been central in Mauritius' approach to social protection in general is the need to assist the vulnerable groups and the need to reduce risks of people sliding back into poverty through assisting individuals to start businesses, and also then to ensure that they put in place measures to ensure that those businesses remain in place. Next slide, please. For Kenya, what happened was that Kenya, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, it had quite a number of innovative ways and approaches to social protection, where there were social assistance grants, some of which included a voluntary social insurance scheme which included the self-employed, and then it also had unemployment benefits that exclude the main one excluded those in the informal economy, but there were social assistance schemes that included those in the informal economy. Then for something like maternity, Kenya had an employment-based maternity scheme, but at the same time, it provided for universal free access to maternity services. And then, so now in the face of COVID, they put in place a raft of measures for social protection, which included cash transfers, and there were grants, and then so there were cash transfers in general for those groups, categories and groups of people that were previously excluded. And then there were now top-ups on the grants that already existed. They put in place grants for elderly orphans that were previously excluded. So these were now brought in, and then they were means tested and included into the social protection scheme. And then as some sort of compensatory social compensation approach, Kenya put in place a number of other reliefs like food distribution through the Emergency Response Fund, business relief measures, which though on the business relief measures, they are primarily focused on the formal and to the exclusion of the informal sector. And then in terms of its post-COVID outlook, Kenya does not, in its analysis, it has not included the extension of social protection to those in the informal sector. We can move to the next slide. And then for South Africa provides an interesting case study on social protection in general and social protection under crisis, and how extensions were made to those that were previously excluded from social protection schemes. So you will see there was the introduction of, for those that were already there, there was a top-up, a once-off cash transfer to assist in adapting to the lockdown measures and all those raft of measures that had been put in place by the government in the wake of COVID. And then they also introduced a special COVID distress relief fund for the unemployed that were not receiving any income from a grant, or those that are unemployed or that had no source of income whatsoever. And then South Africa also included a special compensation for occupational acquired COVID. So there is that provides now an outplay of how the issue of exclusion is. So for that one, it's governed by under COIDA. So those that were previously excluded were excluded initially. However, through lobbying, because there has been a court case including recognizing the need for social protection and inclusion of domestic workers, for example, in the occupational compensation for occupational hazard scheme. However, the laws have not yet been amended accordingly. So when this measure was put in place, the domestic workers, for example, were excluded. However, through lobbying, they managed to ensure that domestic workers and all other workers, irregardless of whether a person is in the informal economy or whatever, they were now included within the scope of the social protection schemes. And then besides that, the government also put in place a number of measures like food distribution, rent relief, and also additional child grants to assist individuals. And then for businesses in the informal economy specifically, they put in place guidelines for resilience and growth for small businesses, which included the self-employed. And then, so you will see in the South African example, for the cash grants, the informal workers, some, like, for example, there had been an exclusion under that special COVID distress relief grant. It excluded people that were refugees and those that are on asylum. However, through lobbying and through a court case, social protection was then extended to non-residents and non-citizens. So going forward, it will be quite interesting to see the extent to which such measures of inclusion of previously excluded groups, like the informal, the self-employed specifically, because within these schemes we have seen a consistent mentioning of the self-employed, a consistent mentioning of all those categories of previously excluded domestic workers within the framework of social protection. So it will be quite interesting to see how the countries are now going to fare as they move forward post-COVID. So I now leave room to my next colleague, Mr. Clement Kasonde, to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Rutendo. Thank you very much, the panelists, Professor Jorens and the other professors, including Claire. Once more, greetings from Zambia. My presentation is focusing on the social security protection system and how the social security protection system has been affected by the COVID pandemic, and how the marginalized workers who are already vulnerable have been pushed into deeper hopelessness in Zambia. I didn't do a comparative study, but I focused on Zambia specifically. But taking into account that Zambia is not an island, it's surrounded by about 7 neighboring countries, including Zimbabwe, where my sister is coming from. So from time to time, I might also share the challenges we've been having as a result of the connectivity and the being surrounded by neighboring countries. I'll look at how COVID-19 has affected the labor market in Zambia, and also how the socio-economic indicators look like from about March 2020 up to where we are now, and also how the social security system has been affected in the context of the Zambian legal framework, the law itself, and how the same has affected the vulnerable workers, and also innovations in the social security system as a result of the COVID-19, and how the Zambian government, working together with other strategic partners, have tried to manage exit from the crisis. And then I conclude. I just want to share that the failed neoliberal policies imposed by World Bank and IMF is a basis for which maybe we are experiencing what we are experiencing, especially in the developing countries, including Zambia. And because of the way we accommodated these neoliberal policies, hoping that they are intended to improve the lives of the people in the southern part of Africa, not knowing that we are now pushed into serious or deeper waters where people start losing jobs as a result of trying to economies and other things. And what we have seen is that instead of being happy, people have been pushed into hopelessness and anguish, job losses, high poverty levels, and also families breaking up as a result of most of the companies which were supporting those few who are working cannot support them anyway. So it has been a challenge in the Southern African country, particularly Zambia. In terms of poverty levels, about 65% are wallowing under poverty. And in terms of informal and formal employment proposition, we have about 80 to 85% informality, whereas the 20 to 25% constitutes the formal sector employment, meaning that in Zambia, we have a highly segmented labor market and that the majority of them are in the informal sector, whereas the few of them are in the formal sector. But the situation in Zambia is in terms of social security protection system, those who are in the informal sector, which constitutes 80 to 85%, are not covered at all. Whereas only about 15 to 20 are those enjoying part of the social security protection system. Meaning that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit Zambia, the situation became even worse than it has been before because of the circumstances in which the labor market is segmented. Meaning we have more now who are more vulnerable and who are unable even to provide for their families as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. And notwithstanding the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 1948 declares every member state to do something in order to ensure that fundamental human rights and the dignity worth of citizens are maintained, and also the issue to promote social progress and the better standard of living. But this has been a problem because of the challenge Zambia has been facing, and also a huge portion of those who are not working. And this has stretched the country slightly further beyond even where we were before the COVID-19. And also my topic was picked because of the theme which we'll be looking at, dealing with innovation in extension of social protection to marginalized workers in Africa, with emphasis on social insurance. And therefore, this appears to resonate well with the theme. In terms of productivity, Zambia has experienced the lowest labor market productivity from March 2020 up to about September or so, because that's the period when we experienced high levels of COVID cases, and also the challenges of businesses or companies trying to scale down on production by reducing man working hours, and also that also has an effect on the economy, including the copper industry, upon which Zambia relies so much for our export earnings, because we depend on copper. When we export more copper, that's when we earn more foreign exchange, which is used to also for repayment, and also that's the only way we obtain cheaper dollar. So with the reduced production in the copper industry as a result of the COVID-19, that has also on net effect affected the country a lot in terms of how productivity is measured in the country. And for example, in terms of socio-economic indicators, I can share with you that with a global economy, which was projected at 4.9 due to adverse COVID-19 pandemic, in the sub-Saharan country, including Zambia, it has been projected that the economies will contract to 3.2 from a positive outturn of 3.1 in 2019. And the commodity prices, including copper, which has been so volatile in 2020 because of the COVID-19, in the first half of the year, averaged 5,500 per metric tons in 2020 as compared to 6,500 in 2019. It's only now that starting from October, the price of copper has increased now from 5.5 to about 7,000 US dollars per metric tons. With the COVID pandemic reducing, it means that the production has started going up, and meaning that there is hope to stabilize the economy, which will also have an effect on the stability of the labor market, and also issues to do with the labor productivity, and which you hopefully should be able to help us deal with poverty levels. We continue on that trend. On social laws which are dealing with the social security protection in Zambia, one of them is the Constitution of Zambia, Act number 2 of 2016, which was amended, and also the Employment Code Act number 3 of 2019, which amended the Employment Act. And these two have expressly provided for social security protection guarantee. And for example, the Constitution of Zambia has made it very expressly clear that even if the business is struggling, when an employee is due for payment of either gratuity or pension benefits, the employee must be paid promptly, and the benefits should not be subject to tax, so it is tax-free, meaning the disposable income of those who are retiring has increased, and meaning that it has a positive effect on how you fight poverty. And also, if the company is unable to pay the retiree or pensioner on the last day of working, the law provides that you have to retain that worker on the payroll until the employee is paid in full. So these are some of the innovations in the Zambian legal framework trying to address issues to do with social security protection because of the guarantee which are provided in the Constitution being the supreme law of the Republic. And in terms of segmentation in the current social security system, we have contributory schemes and non-contributory schemes working alongside. So meaning that employees can be entitled to pension benefits under contributory scheme and also under non-contributory scheme. Although now there is a shift because of the COVID-19 that the government has come up with a cabinet memo to direct all employees, especially in the public sector, to ensure that the occupational pension which is non-contributed, are abolished so that Zambia can only maintain with a contributory scheme, and meaning that the way the pension scheme has been managed in Zambia, the overall is that instead of benefiting from both sides, the non-contributory and contributory pension schemes, this now means that the take-home pension benefits for the workers is being reduced. This is as a result of the COVID-19, which has impacted the economy. And in terms of just a moment, in terms of other innovations, in July 2020, the Minister of Community Development and Social Welfare came up with an emergency COVID-19 social cash transfer scheme to try and help the vulnerable communities and homes of the elderly, women and children to survive the COVID-19 by increasing the social cash transfer grants. And by 25th September 2020, the Minister of Finance, Dr. Kanyongolo, when he delivered the national budget, also increased the budget line for social cash transfer system to try and address the issues of vulnerable families and employees. And this is one of the innovations which was brought into the social security protection system to ensure that those who are so vulnerable, maybe in one or the other, be mitigated. And further, there was also an undertaking by Minister of Labor and Social Security, Honorable Joyce Inonde, after consultation with the tripartite consultative labor council partners, including employers and employees, to try and tone down the conflict in the labor market. They came up with an SI, Statutory Instrument number 48 of 2020, which is an exemption regulation to Employment Code Act, which provides for the fact that when the business is unable to manage to pay benefits or even sending employees on leave whilst the business is trying to improve itself, they should not be sent or become so destitute, but they wanted to find a way of how they can manage, make the businesses survive, and also to sustain the jobs of the employees. So this is Statutory Instrument number 48 of 2020 has been enacted as a win-win situation between employees and employers so that business can continue being sustainable. At the same time, employees are also protected so that it doesn't create huge job losses, which might also trigger other things like high poverty levels as a result of loss of income for the many workers in Zambia.
I'm sorry to intervene, Mr. Kasonde, but perhaps I would propose that
in my conclusion, sorry,
we're running out of time. I'm sorry.
Okay. In my conclusion, I have quoted what Adam Smith said, that even if you have serious challenges, you have to find a way of taking care of the poor and those who are miserable. And therefore, certain measures must be introduced by policymakers to ensure that those who are vulnerable must have something to eat in order to live for another day. And this is very important because everyone has a right to life, despite the fact that we are faced with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think in a nutshell, that's how I've summarized my presentation. And thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry to have interrupted you, but of course, we also want to have these questions, perhaps we have time with the participants. So I would like to thank all of you for their contribution. I think we have seen that the economic crisis is all over and reactions are quite similar to a big extent between all of us in the country. So thank you very much. And I hope that we now can go into a debate with each other and with the public. Thank you.
Great, so we're now going to move on to some questions. I've got some interesting questions coming through on the platform, and you'll just indicate which of the speakers wants to answer that question. The first question from Professor van Eck is, how should developing countries deal with the second wave? No more funds to subsidize, but we need to save lives and keep the economy going. Does anyone want to take that question?
Well, if I may try to reply, because I think it's $1 million question, and every country is dealing with it in a different way. But what we can see that countries are trying to achieve that balance on a different way, and differently in the second wave than in the first wave, because there were so much unknown variables related to the virus. And now I think it's more important, or more important than in the first wave, to preserve economy and also focus on certain professions that can work from distance and focus on hospital beds and so on. So quite differently that in the first wave where there was a complete lockdown. So, but I think every country is dealing with it on its own way.
Yes. And then if I can also add on, from an Africa perspective, looking at the approaches adopted by the different African countries, you will see that, yes, though we are now getting into the second phase, already a certain number of policy measures had already been put forward for post-COVID. And the good thing is, in those post-COVID recovery programs, health, they were key, the way that they were drafting the policies, they already prioritized areas that have now become important under the second phase. So you will see that certain key departments or sectors of the economy that they know that these are booming sectors. Yes, they'll have tourism for recovery purposes, but they also had primary sectors promotion. So I think within the policy framework, especially in Africa, it was already anticipated, but what will be needed now is just refocusing again of the policies so that they are adjusted again so as to meet the second wave.
Yeah, if I can add something shortly on that, I think, and as Grega said as well, the big question is what's going to happen in a couple of months or years. We told you that a crisis always has long-standing effects. For example, in the European Union, there's currently a huge debate going on about the installation of the European Unemployment Benefit Scheme, that in a certain way would support all the member states to a longer perspective than just, so it's very curious to see what's going on this respect.
Great, so I'm going to move on to the next question, and again, just come in when you want to. Desmond van der Westhuizen says, corruption is a risk that needs to be mitigated for the relief schemes implemented. What is the best way to deal with this risk? Anyone want to take that question?
Okay, I guess let me start on corruption. And maybe perhaps if you notice, the approaches I usually give tend to be a bit on the more practical side of how African governments have been grappling with this issue. And I think for corruption, there were a number of issues that emerged during this pandemic. Issues of misuse of funds, issues of reallocation of funds, issues of distribution, questions to do with procurement. But going forward, how best corruption can be dealt with is some countries have already started doing that. So, say for example, enhancing the whistleblower laws. And then also the issue of lobbying by civil society. So you will notice in a number of countries, civil society, journalists, and a number of parties, they have really played a vital role in exposing corruption within most of the African countries. And then also partnerships between civil society as well as anti-corruption agencies. So already existing anti-corruption agencies, and now there are now partnerships between civil society and those agencies so as to root out corruption. So I think those are the different approaches that have been put in place in Africa.
Anyone else wants to come in on that particular question?
Well, I mean, not really about corruption, of course. Corruption is a very particular issue in that respect, but I can assure you that we have a current interesting way is how some of the measures that have been taken by member states are controlled. We have to admit, even in our own country, we have noticed that the government decided from time to time just to spend money and to basically say, well, every time you have an economic crisis, just use the money. We give you the money even without controlling every other measure. So it was even sufficient that you belong to a certain economic sector to get money, not even immediately demonstrating that you had a big economic loss. Now, this is some of the worries that exist to a certain extent if we are not being too flexible to a certain approach. Of course, we understand all the negative consequences, but there are now questions how indeed also our inspection services can control this to a bigger extent. At the meantime, or at the same time, we have to admit that people who control for the moment COVID-19 measures are not the most popular people in the population and in society, and they have a lot of problems.
Can I move on to the next question? I'm going to take a final question. This is from Mr. Ruben Philander. Given the nature of the disease and recent development in regards to a vaccine, should a sunset clause be incorporated for stimulus packages or social protection? Or should stimulus or social protection packages be of general application and not confined to COVID-19 instances? Anyone want to kickstart that discussion?
What is the question? Again, sorry, I lost connectivity because of fluctuation in the power. I'm sorry.
Sure, I'll read it out again. Given the nature of the disease and recent development in regards to a vaccine, should a sunset clause be incorporated for stimulus packages and social protection? Or should stimulus and social protection packages be of general application and not confined to COVID-19 instances? Did you get that?
Thank you for the question. Maybe I can try to reply. I think many temporary measures tend to be permanent at the end of the day. But as we can witness at the moment, many measures are confined, ratione tempori, so confined in time for several months or by the end of the year and so on. But I think it's also an opportunity to see what kind of solidarity we can live and regulate even after COVID-19 crisis, pandemic. Should it be only based on a national state? Also an African perspective, should it be SADC region? Should it be East and Central African community? Should it be African Union? Should it be global solidarity? We can see that we can be solidaric also globally because information was shared on the genome of the virus and then vaccine was relatively quickly developed. So I think there is hope for solidarity and for better measures and better social security and social protection in general for the future after COVID-19. I know I'm being a bit romantic, but there is a chance. Whether we will use it or not depends on us and on policymakers, of course.
Anyone else want to add their views?
Yes. Okay. I mean, and shortly, I don't want to be not romantic. I wasn't there to do that to a certain extent, but I think it's correct, definitely correct, that it makes us a lot of reflection about how our system will look alike in the forthcoming years. What we've learned, for example, from the previous financial crisis, 2007, 2010, is that a lot of new instruments in labor and social security law have been installed. The short-term allowances became very popular at that stage. We see them again popping up now, and we see them, and what we saw is that these measures, although perhaps they were meant to be temporary, stayed basically after the crisis in 2007. So the question will indeed be, how can we safeguard that? And as I mentioned, certainly, and we should look that to a more global level. The debate of a European unemployment benefit scheme fits into that, because there needs to be a global support. Let's not forget that COVID-19 is basically a crisis that nobody has chosen to have. And that is a crisis that is not a result of some national measures, but is a crisis, is a global crisis affecting everybody, without being every measures could have been taken in advance. So I'm also looking a little bit further to the debates on that. But I noticed that Clément wanted to add something as well. So.
Thank you, Professor. I agree with your professor and Professor Gregor that the COVID-19 is a global crisis. It's a global issue. And therefore, there must be a concerted effort to deal with this issue at international level, regional and domestic, in order for all the countries to manage this pandemic, because it's not just isolated to a particular jurisdiction or a country. And coming to a domestic solution, Zambia in particular, one of the policy measures which has been undertaken, which I did not mention in my pre-recorded audio message, is that there is a law in place now to try and address the challenges facing by the majority of employees or workers who are trapped in the informal sector, which constitutes the largest portion of about 80 to 85. And what the government has done in consultation with all stakeholders is to promulgate the law called National Health Insurance Act number 2 of 2018, which extends the social protection to the informal sector, but being funded by the formal sector jobs. So it's one way of trying to prepare for any crisis in future dealing with the health issues, so that they are not left behind. Because if there was no such extension of such coverage, and they are already vulnerable, they have low income, and they can be hit terribly. So these are domestic born solution, but which can feed into regional and international. So I just wanted to share with that Zambia is also coming up with homegrown solution to deal with the informality by extending the social protection to insurance scheme to informal sector by this law, which is being funded by formal sector workers. Yeah.
Great. Does anyone have anything to add? No. Any concluding remarks from anyone? Are we happy to proceed? Well, thank you all for your contribution and for answering the questions. I know it's always difficult when you put on the spot, but we do appreciate it. And so that brings us to the end of a successful third African Labour Law Society conference. Thank you to all of our speakers and to our delegates for your attendance, for participating, and for your patience. This is new territory for all of us, and we do appreciate your patience. Please be reminded that the recordings of all of the sessions will be uploaded, and they will remain on the virtual platform for 30 days after conclusion of the conference. In addition, the presentations will be uploaded to YouTube, and those links will be made available on the conference page. And we look forward to interacting, hopefully face-to-face at the next conference. Thank you all.